Hey y'all, this is Hamza, and I'm super happy we get to hang out for a little bit. All right, welcome to Hanging Out with Hamza. Today we have a special guest on. She's one of my good friends. This is special to me because we're going to be talking about mental health, which I find super interesting and I've focused a lot more on in the last 2 years. And I was lucky enough to meet Lacy, who has been extremely awesome and kind of like guiding me along the way, on top of having a therapist. And luckily enough, she is a therapist, a licensed therapist. And so we'll be covering that and talking about Lacy's passions. Just to give you like a background, Lacy and I have been friends for almost a year now. And our friendships developed really, really naturally. We're both huge fans of the same artists and music. We're really close in that stratosphere. And she lives in Austin as well. And so I really wanted to have her on the podcast to talk in person about this stuff because I feel like this is one of those discussions that are better had in person too. But yeah, I'm just going to pass the torch over to Lacy, let her introduce herself and give you all a bit more info about herself.
Oh man, hello. I know other guests said they're nervous, but me too. Even though we're together, I'm like, oh my gosh. So, first of all, I adore this human. I'm so honored to be seriously on this. And I think it's so exciting that there's these conversations happening between friends because you don't always get that opportunity to like talk through these things.
Right.
And I think it's such a gift. So that's my first thing. And I think you have done so much growing even in the last year since I first met you. And like seeing that and being part of that and even like being in your world, amazing. So thankful.
Thanks, Lacy.
So I would also just reiterate that has been so valuable and this is super special. As far as me, I am a licensed clinical social worker. So I've been doing this for a little while. I've been all over the place within the field of social work. I got my undergrad in that, and then I got my master's in that. And so because I did both, I got to do a shorter master's program. So if anyone's looking to do that, I highly recommend shortening that time frame and just doing both the same thing. I started off in like social work as far as like developmental disability, so folks who are experiencing that. And so I worked with some individuals with that stuff, learned a ton, moved into adoption, which was why I actually became a social worker. So I got to dive into infant domestic adoption, which was great. And then I went from there into schools. And so that was high school is where I started in Washington, where I went to get my master's, which was awesome. High school was definitely very different than infant baby stuff and stuff with parents, but really exciting. And it's a really cool phase of life. And so I was really stoked on specifically working in schools. So I also, while I was in Washington, worked in the hospitals and did kind of some ER work as well as like the psych unit for adults. And so that's really hefty mental health. And I got to see some of the most intensive moments of people's lives where they've had huge experiences that were usually pretty traumatic that led them to the hospital, where I would get to serve them and get to support their family through the process and really see kind of that side of the lens, which is a really hard one, but also a really honest one on where mental health can go.
Right.
And then I went back to schools because I was so excited about it and did some behavioral schools. So again, with folks experiencing significant mental health. So kids or adolescents that were basically unable to be in the public education system because they were unsafe due to their mental health at school.
Oh.
So I went into that and I did that for a little less than a year because it was so hard. And then we ended up switching gears and I went back into public schools and did behavioral support. So kids who are, again, really struggling with their mental health and exhibiting a lot of behaviors because of it at school. And then from there, I started private practice and now I get to do therapy every day, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And a little bit more specific to what I am super excited about and with some different demographics than I feel like I was in schools.
What's the new thing that you're specific into right now?
Sure. Yeah. So I still do definitely adolescents. I do a lot less little kids. So I've worked in like literally elementary school, middle school, high school, and colleges.
Okay.
But I kind of am off of the really small kids just because you can't get as far with their mental health because they just aren't developed in the same way. And so I like the like one-on-one connection piece that you get with either adolescents or adults.
Right.
Because you actually get to like converse a little more,
Yeah.
where the little ones is more of like a behavior modification due to what's going on.
Yeah.
So that's a shift. And I think even adults, I was pretty leery on working with adults for a long time. Like I worked with parents, but I was definitely more focused on kids and adolescents.
What made you leery about it?
Oh man, I think they're just so complicated, right? We're all so complicated. And I think we all have patterns of thought. And so we all have like these very ingrained things based on our childhood, our experience, our trauma that then adults get really stuck in. And so I think my ultimate fear when I went into it was like, first of all, can I be a good enough therapist to shift that for people or help people see a different perspective?
Yeah.
And kind of undo some of that work. And I think that was pretty intimidating to me.
Yeah.
And then also, I think like the power dynamic, right, is just so different than like with kids, where it's like, oh, I can go in and not have imposter syndrome because I know that I have.
Do you still have it right now? Or do you still deal with that? Or do you feel
I think all therapists do.
Yeah.
I think being in this field, we would love to say no. I would love to be like, no, I love it and I know everything.
Yeah.
But that's not real.
Yeah.
And
we all like have our own issues. So you probably feel like,
yeah.
Does it feel like, I remember one therapist told me they kind of sometimes feel like a hypocrite because they're like telling things to patients and sometimes they're guilty of doing it themselves.
Oh,
so do you feel that all the time? Yeah.
I wouldn't say all the time. I think there's certain things I'm like, oh, that's going okay.
Yeah.
Then there are those things in my life that I'm like, oh, I struggle with this too, right? Yeah. And I try to be open in a positive manner with my folks that I work with in order for them to see that I'm a person.
Yeah.
And I come from that lens.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's authentic if you don't.
Yeah.
And I have gone through therapy myself. And so I actually have had therapists who were really honest and open with me about their own stuff. And that impacted me in the way of like, oh my gosh, we're both people. Yeah. And it felt more of a connection than I've also gone to a therapist who felt really methodical and really by the book.
Yeah.
Like she was like writing notes and like I felt like it was a checklist.
Is it hard for you as a therapist to see a therapist? Because I feel like for me as a dentist to see a dentist, I'm always like critical of them or overcritical. So does that affect your therapy? Because I think that's interesting how like you're going to a therapist to get help and, you know, to just go through therapy, which is normal. But since it's your line of work, do you ever see what they're saying to you and like I don't know, I feel like you can like analyze what they're saying to you because you were taught a certain way to talk to patients and stuff. So
yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think about that for like you, right? Being in dentistry, I'm sure you're like, what's happening?
Yeah, but that's like, I feel like not as bad because at the end of the day, I don't see them as often. So like when it does happen, it is annoying, but then I'm like, won't see them for a couple months again. But you as a therapist, like I do therapy every week or every other week. And so you're seeing them a lot more often. And so I always wonder how that is on your end. Yeah,
it's tricky. I think my experience would be that can be a really big turnoff for me with therapy. Yeah. Like I had one that I started with when I was like, I don't know, 14. And so I was young and I was younger than that actually, now that I think about that. I was like 11. Yeah. So even younger than even 14. And so because I think that power dynamic was there, I was able to be like, oh, she's amazing. She knows so much, right? And I took a lot of like wisdom from her. And then going through school, you get this knowledge. Yeah. So then the first one I saw was after I'd already done grad school. Okay. And I was like, oh my gosh, she is doing all of these things that I do to other people. Yeah. And I even was like, please don't paraphrase me. Yeah. Like I had to like. You told her that? Oh yes. Wow. I asked her directly. I was like, please don't do that. Wow. That feels really uncomfortable for me and I needed to feel like a conversation. Yeah. And so I think like I'm pretty direct and so I just had to be like, that doesn't feel good. Yeah. Like I know what's happening.
And they were pretty receptive about it?
She was receptive. I think there were some challenges with her in regards to like, she was kind of all over the place and like would eat snacks while we were talking and just different things that I was like, yeah. Like I want you to be a little bit more of an authentic connection, but not like to the point of eating your snacks. Right.
That's
So
wild.
yeah,
That's like a whole different world. Well,
yeah.
have you ever had a therapist or have you ever given therapy to a therapist or
Yes.
yeah?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
have you ever had that issue happen, like where they're analyzing you or
I mean,
they're,
I think that happens,
yeah.
right? I think it does. I have seen a couple
Do you
therapists.
feel like you interact differently with them based on that or approach it differently because of that? Yeah.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
So I started that from the get go. And actually, what's really weird is when I started my practice, I knew that that was something that people specialize in, is
Yeah.
right, seeing other professionals.
Yeah.
I didn't anticipate doing that right away. I anticipated definitely doing that later in my
Yeah.
career, but it started right away where somebody reached out and I was like, oh, you're a professional and
Yeah.
you want to see me. And so I think early on I was like surprised. And then ultimately, like that went so well that I actually found that I love it.
Yeah. Is there like a specialty for therapists to see therapists or anything like that? No.
I mean, you could specialize in that and
Yeah.
you could really hone your marketing towards those
Right.
folks. And that is something that people do.
Yeah.
Like, there are therapists who only see other
Interesting.
therapists and like other mental health, right?
Yeah.
Or they see doctors
Right.
or people who work in schools or, right, like firemen.
Yeah.
There's different things that you can really hone in on and really learn a lot about that. Or if you have that experience,
Yeah.
that helps too.
Okay.
But I would say there's a different connection. And even early on, if I meet a therapist and I know that they already are, I initially say, I want this to feel like a conversation. I know you know how therapy works. We all know that we need our own therapy regardless of our knowledge. And so it becomes more of like, how can I reflect back to them? Because we all have spots we don't see.
Right.
And I have therapists come to me and they're like, I'm stuck,
Yeah.
right? Like, I figured out XYZ, and they'll like come with tons of stuff like written down, and they've mapped it.
Yeah.
And then I get to be like, okay, well, let's look at it like this. And they're still surprised, just like every other patient or client I see,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's the same exact process,
Yeah.
just a little bit more of a banter. I would say
Yeah.
there's more banter is
Okay.
maybe a good way to put it.
And then going off that, do you feel like as a therapist, when you hang out with friends, like when you hang out with me or anyone, do you feel like you're overanalyzing people or do you ever turn that on? Because I brought that with you before and I was like, I don't know, like if you have trouble turning that switch off sometimes.
I love this question.
Yeah.
I face this question every day of my life.
Which, sorry for asking it, but I feel like the listeners are probably thinking the same thing. So now they can finally have an official verdict on the answer.
Yeah, I just giggle at that because it's such a common thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certain times that's hard.
Yeah. I mean, as a dentist, I do that all the time. Like,
I'm
if
sure.
I see some tooth that's like something's going wrong with somebody's teeth, like, I'm not obviously going to verbalize it, but I see it and I notice it. So I was wondering, like, from your end, even in relationships, I'm sure there's like times when you can probably easily suss out things that not many people can see, which is definitely a superpower to have. But sometimes it can probably be annoying because, like, you have to, like, shut that out too, right?
Yeah, I would say you nailed it, right? It's sometimes a superpower where I'm like, oh, cool. I know this about you and I'm not really going to engage.
Yeah.
Or it can be like, oh my gosh, I know this and that's actually really frustrating that I'm seeing this.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, right, my friends or people I'm interested in or dating aren't ready to change.
Right.
And so then I'm just in this weird spot of like, oh, do I point this out?
Yeah.
Do I not point this out?
Yeah.
Does that cross a line? So it does put me in sometimes a really awkward position.
Yeah.
I think especially with dating.
Yeah, I'm sure guys like probably feel like you're constantly analyzing them or like
oh yeah.
I don't know, do they ever like tell you like stop therapizing me or something like that?
Oh, I've heard it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I can say anything and they're gonna assume that.
Yeah, that's true.
I also would say the people who have asked those questions typically are struggling with something they don't want me to see.
Yeah.
Or they don't feel ready to dive into in some regard. And so I feel like people do say that, but I would say most people who are pretty comfortable with where they're at would just be like, oh, like you understand. Right. And it'd be more of this like vulnerable connection instead of a like, you're therapizing me in a defensive response, at least from what I've seen. I'm sure that's different for different people.
Yeah.
But even within friendships, right? I notice things, I see things.
Yeah, I mean, as your friend, I can verify that. Like, you're very well engaged with me. Whenever I talk to you, full eye contact, listening fully, intently, which, like, everybody should do. But I think as a therapist, you have that extra kind of, like, strength in it. And I really admire it because it kind of teaches me how, like, you know, the correct way to interact, communicate. Because sometimes I don't know, just the way we're raised or something. Like sometimes
Mhm.
your communication is different based on what you're used to being like the right way to communicate.
Yeah.
But it is nice because I feel like every time I talk to you, you're fully there, you're fully
Mhm.
present, listening to me. And yeah, that's why I thought you'd be an awesome guest on this podcast. She even has notes on here, so
I'm
I
ready.
don't want to like drift off too far, but
No, I
I
love
will
it.
ask questions that people probably ask therapists
Oh,
all the
I
time,
want to
just so
know.
you can clear the air.
Yeah.
But one last question I was going to ask was, do you, I'm sure as a therapist, because coming from me as a dentist, I get
Mhm.
friends that I won't hear for years and randomly will text me with a picture of something in their mouth and being
Mm.
like, what's going on? Or like, what's going on? And, it's like,
Yeah.
technically that's my job. And it's not like you go up to an engineer and you're just like, hey, can you like help
Solve
engineer
this.
this? Right. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's weird because as friends, we're putting these like weird things where people think that they can just ask you off the bat, even when you're
Mhm.
off the clock. And so as a therapist, do you deal with that often? I'm sure you do.
Mhm.
And when you do, how do you interact with patient or how do you interact with those friends and bring up the subject?
Yeah. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like I do get put in sticky spots.
Yeah.
That is absolutely
I'm
true,
sure.
just
Yeah.
like you. I think where it becomes a little bit wild is if it's a safety concern, because then I'm literally obligated to
Yeah.
step up and to do something about it. Where sometimes if it's something that's not a crisis or not a safety concern, I can be like, hey,
And what
I,
would sorry to
no,
interrupt,
no,
what
no,
would
please.
constitute as like a crisis? Is it more like abuse or like suicidal, like probably all the above?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it. So it would be right, like, absolutely, if someone is a safety concern for themselves. So if they have suicidality, are thinking about that, talking about that,
Yeah.
or going through with that, right? I've gotten those calls. I've had friends that I know from, right, like undergrad or different areas of life that I'm no longer connected to,
Yeah.
but then they post on Facebook, right, something about wanting to commit suicide. And I'm then put in a position of, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
what am I going to do about this?
And have you, I'm assuming you've been put in that position, but
Mhm.
has it been a pretty significant amount of times or?
Yeah, I feel like quite a few.
Wow.
Or I have somebody be like, hey, this person's doing this, and
Yeah.
this is like something that's going on. What do I do? And sometimes I can be like, XYZ is your steps, right? Do this process.
Right.
Other times, mental health is so complicated and so sticky and so gray
Yeah.
and not black and white that I'm like, I'm so outside of the situation, I can't really help you,
Yeah.
but I can help you find somebody who can.
Okay.
So then I kind of guide them back to how can I help you find a professional
Right.
for yourself or for this other person,
Okay.
and kind of remove myself
Yeah.
from the dynamic.
And what about for those people who are just like, obviously it's not that serious, it's
Mhm.
something more kind of superficial level? Like, how do
Mhm.
you approach those people? And this goes for
Mhm.
people listening to who are probably looking at being therapists and maybe that's
Yeah.
something they're concerned about or wondering how you approach those subjects.
Yeah, it's a good question. Kind of depends, right, on like my connection to that other individual who's asking.
Yeah.
I would say boundaries.
Right.
I love boundaries.
Yeah.
I love them. I think they're so good.
Yeah.
And I think they're so important. And I think we talk about them in a way that makes them sound harsh.
Yeah.
But I think there's so many graceful and kind ways
Right.
to compassionately set those boundaries up. And so typically what I'll do is I'll like support the friend, talk through it. I can also catch myself when I'm in kind of therapy role. Like there's a shift
Yeah.
in the way I ask questions, I would say mostly. And so if I catch myself, I say, hey, I'm noticing you're really struggling with this. I love you. I care about you. I'm in your corner. But I can't ultimately always be that person for you.
Right.
Because that's just not feasible. I can't do that at work and at home and with every single person in my life. But I would say there's also like this part of me that is compassionate and caring and empathetic just in general.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's my relationships with friends.
Yeah.
Like that's just like naturally who I am too. And so I think it's mostly for me identifying like if it's like hurting my life or not serving me or not like feeling okay and I'm crossing a line. And that's a hard thing to gauge sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think it's ultimately going back to kind of like that gut check. In social work and therapy, we talk about gut check all the time as professionals. And like I have an amazing supervisor and she all the time will be like, what's your gut say? And that's ultimately like sometimes what has to guide you.
Yeah.
And so I think like for me, the gut check is where I'm like, ooh, that feels sticky.
Yeah.
Or, oof, I don't like that. And then I ultimately set that boundary.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it's always gone well.
That's great advice. Okay. Well, keep that in mind, guys. No matter what profession you're in, set some boundaries in them.
Yeah.
But yeah, obviously, as you know, this podcast is about passions, and there's been a pretty big running theme of people's passions being their profession, which is
Mm.
great so far. I've had a 2 for 2 so far. So um, now being the third one, you did mention that, being a therapist is your passion and you do love what you do, which is incredible. I think
Yeah.
like not many people are fortunate enough to be in a job that they love like this. And it's always great as a friend seeing that because it not only motivates me, but it's just fun to see because like every time I hang out with you, it's like we talk about it at some point, and like me being in therapy now, and I think like the stars aligned really well to where I met you at a time when I started really valuing therapy. And if I knew you 3 or 4 years ago, I wouldn't have really put much thought into it.
Yeah.
Um,
It's true.
and so with that being said, therapy being your passion, do you want to kind of dive deeper into like why it's your passion and what drove you into it? And I guess what strengthened it since you've been in it? Sorry. I'm trying to fight my cough, so if you guys hear me sounding weird, that's why. But go for it.
I
I'm
love
trying
it.
not to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, you're good. Don't worry. If you have to cough, do it up.
Yeah, I'll try.
Good questions. I would say it's a passion. I think, especially mental health, it's a hard job. It's a hard like profession to be in every day, and so you have to love it to some extent to make it.
Yeah.
And you see people even in school, especially grad school, you see people fall off because they realize that they're not passionate about it enough to make it through the things you have to manage and deal with.
Yeah.
Because you have secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Right? You experience that every day.
Yeah, it's not an easy job for sure.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's fascinating that, I mean, I had in dental school where people thought they loved it and by second or third year hated it or just like realized this is a lot of money I'm putting into this and a lot of time and I don't know if it's right for me. So with therapy, I think like with that being said, you do deal with all this trauma and all this other stuff. So even if you do love it, you're adding more of the stuff that's could potentially make you not love it. But in your case, it sounds like it's done the opposite, which is incredible.
Yeah.
But was there ever a moment where you doubted it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There have been a few moments I've doubted it. I wouldn't be honest with myself if I said there weren't.
Yeah.
I think my thought around it is whatever headspace I go into it with is what's going to come out, right? So if I go in and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these people are driving me nuts. They're not changing. They're not like willing to look at these things. They're struggling too much. And then I go in with that. I'm going to come out at the end of the day and be like, wow, it was a terrible day.
Yeah.
I got nowhere.
Right.
And so I think for me, it comes down to like, how do I go in with that unconditional positive regard towards every human I interact with during my workday? And then also, how do I like keep the hope and instill that in myself and instill that resilience in these people?
Yeah.
Because it is hard and it is heavy.
Yeah.
And I think the moments that I've seen myself not feel motivated and struggle were when there were really significant safety concerns for my well-being.
Right.
Right? Like in the adult psych unit, there are some very significant safety concerns that can happen, right? Like people are violent. Yeah. Like, and when they're having a mental health crisis to the extent that they are, if they're hospitalized, there's a lot of different triggers that you don't know.
Yeah.
And like people do get sedated and like there are things that happen and you see that are really, really scary.
Yeah.
And I think as like a young female working in the ER and in the psych unit taught me a lot about the realities of what that looks like.
Yeah.
And made me question some things, right? When I saw horrific violence happen towards one of the nurses I worked with, that was a moment I was like, why am I doing this? Yeah. Right? And seeing that and seeing like that she could never be a nurse again and had a TBI because someone was so violent towards her at work, like you question everything.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, I'm putting myself in this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people overlook, like, I think a lot of people assume therapy is though just like you're just sitting down and talking to this person, but they don't realize in order for you to get to where you are, you've had to go through a lot of, going to a psych ward, doing stuff like that. And so you interact with a lot of different types of people and it can leave a lot of that secondary trauma, like you said. And then maybe you could just go into an office where you're just seeing like adults that are fully functional human beings, but it's a tough job. And I think you carry over a lot of stuff, just like nurses and a lot of other professions, but I don't think therapists are magnified in that extent to
Mhm.
realize like how much you guys go through. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely good to know because yeah, even when you bring it up to me, a lot of this is news to me that
Mm.
I wasn't aware of. So it's
Yeah.
pretty incredible. But
Yeah. One, I think we don't talk about it, right? Because you ultimately, even me, I had to be like, okay, how do I want my career to look?
yeah,
Because I realized like some of those things I was witnessing every day, I couldn't hold space for myself.
yeah,
And so, like most therapists have done other parts of that job or other parts of the field, right? Like counselors or social workers, whatever they may be. Um, and we don't talk about those things because you're then in the room sitting across from somebody,
yeah,
and like that's a completely different phase where you don't talk about yourself.
right,
And you also like I think for me, I struggle to talk about those things because like I also honor that that person was having such an experience and they were in so much suffering and pain that they then exhibited these behaviors that aren't authentic to who they are.
yeah,
And so I think I struggle with that, especially some with my adults, but more so with like the kiddos I worked with that were really violent
yeah,
and made me question a little bit of what I was doing.
yeah,
Because I also really care and I know that that's not who they are.
yeah.
And people have to do those jobs. Like those people need love and support and somebody there.
And how do you, I guess, separate that? Because I feel like
Mhm.
it's such a hard thing because you care about these people and you genuinely want to help them, but then
Yeah.
how do you find that line to draw when you're done with your job and you're off the clock? How do you not
Mm.
bring that into your personal life or worry about them outside of it?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
I think that's goes back to your last question, and that's why I shifted, was because it wasn't
yeah,
something that I was able to leave at the door
yeah,
in a few of my jobs. And so if I notice that it's coming over into my personal life, it's mostly in like a cognitive way where I notice my thoughts were more negative, right? Those early signs of burnout where I was like, okay, I'm really negative. I'm not enjoying things I like outside of work very much.
yeah,
I'm isolating because it can be really isolating to see these things and like people don't always understand what you're talking about because it's just kind of a little bit wild.
yeah,
And so I think as soon as I see that is when I'm like, okay, I have to switch.
yeah,
And I also think now I've learned a lot more self care, my well being, self compassion for myself is really key in me making it out of my day. Like I have certain rituals at the end of my workday I do every single day
okay,
because it signifies for me, okay, I'm done,
yeah,
right? That's closed and I'm moving to the next part of my life. So I think that's helped me a lot. Also, I would say within this field, like if you're ever going to, as a listener, do this, right? You have amazing people who then support you, and you have a supervisor for a couple of years outside of grad school. And so those people can teach you the things they've learned because they've obviously made it in the field. And so having somebody in your corner to talk to professionally is key. And like having that supervisor, I've been so blessed
yeah,
with amazing mentors
right,
who I would not be who I am personally or professionally without them.
right,
And they've really helped me learn those skills. And even like still to this day, my supervisor will check in and she'll be like, are you doing your self-care?
that's
How you
awesome.
doing?
Yeah,
Right? Are you good?
that's good.
And so like having somebody who also like keeps me accountable to that is key. Because we can't always see ourselves.
Right,
And like in those jobs where I was struggling, I don't think I saw it until finally somebody was like, yeah, right. It was my sister. She's like, what's happening?
yeah,
You are so stressed all the time. And so I think having people who like reflect that back is key.
and how are you feeling now? Like since your new job and everything, have you been in a much better place with that?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's
So
awesome.
much better. Private practice,
Yeah,
I will say, is the way to go.
yeah, I can vouch for that.
I
And
think
I think it transfers to most professions, but yeah, it gives you more autonomy and more control of your life and
mhm.
whatnot. So that's great.
You also get to shift like the kind of people you serve too into things you're really passionate about.
Right.
And I think that served me really well too.
Okay.
And going a little bit away from crisis, which I love and adore, and I can work through and I actually really enjoy.
Yeah.
But like to things that I enjoy just as much that are more on that like functional, hopeful side in a more like productive way. It feels more productive for
Yeah.
me. And so I think now I'm like happier, healthier.
And you're doing it mostly over the phone and in person, right? Or is
So
it one or
mostly
the other?
telehealth, actually.
Telehealth. Okay.
Yeah. So it's like a video, basically like a Zoom call on
Yeah.
a certain platform.
Okay.
It's sometimes phone calls.
Yeah.
I have a lot of folks who love to walk and talk,
Yeah.
which I love because then they're like walking around getting movement in.
Yeah.
It's a little easier, I think,
Right.
for them not to just like stare at me because that's also not always fun for people to be like, you're staring at me. Like, I know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting. I did that over COVID for a while.
Yeah.
So outside of obviously your current position, I know you had some notes. Is there anything you wanted to kind of address or talk about that you thought were important for people?
That's a good question. I think I wrote notes because, right? I was like, oh, I gotta talk about so many
Yeah, I
things.
mean, if
So
there's
scary.
anything that you want to talk about, you're welcome to. But if you're happy with how the flow is going, we can keep going.
I mean, I love it. You're asking so many great questions. I would say, like, one of the main things is like, when you even asked me on this, right? Like, what's my passion?
Yeah.
It made me so excited because that's what I feel like I get to do in therapy.
Yeah.
Is like help people align their passions
Yeah.
with like what they're doing. And so, like, this concept of like moving towards what's meaningful is what I like try to help all my clients do.
Right.
And I think like you having this podcast and like igniting this in other people is so exciting because we don't always have people being like, yes, what are you passionate about?
Yeah.
How are we doing it? What can we do to like get you to that?
Yeah.
And like, how can we like promote that in others?
Yeah.
Especially in the US, right? We have all these like work harder, do more, all these expectations that are not promoting like
that hustle culture, but like without the drive or ambition for it. Just like you're just doing it to do it. But yeah, I mean, I think I did this for a number of reasons, but one thing, like I'm kind of every day taking a step back to think like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the purpose behind everything? And with the podcast, another thing I realized is when I went through that depression, I, like you said, you like lose that love for things you do every day. And I started to like, you know, not like doing simple things like even just watching movies. And I love movies. And it was terrifying because it gave me kind of a glimpse into like what my life could be like without passions or without having like this like love for things. And yeah, that's why I wanted to do this, to not only kind of instill that in other people or bring that out of people, but also, you know, spark that passion in me. Because when you're around people that are like that, it's very contagious, and it's like it kind of reminds you like, oh, this is how happy you can be talking about things you love. And so that was the thing with you, is like whenever you talk about therapy, I was always so like enthralled by it, and I was always like, you know, I'm always intrigued by it. And you know that whenever I hang out with you, I'm always asking questions about it because I think it's such an interesting profession, and the people that are in it are clearly passionate about it because of the stuff you guys go through. So, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you wanted to be on this podcast. I'm glad you wanted to talk about it. I did want to bring up, like, in my last episode, I had a guest on who is an incredible person. That his views about depression and mental health are a little bit different than what, you know, your goal is to inspire with people. So I wanted to kind of see how you approach that subject in terms of people who don't identify it as being a clinical issue, or how you address that kind of stuff. And if you want to kind of delve deeper into that and talk about that more.
Yeah. First of all, I am so excited that you like are willing to talk about mental health and like share your story, because that's how like people actually feel accepted and seen in the world, right? And igniting that like passion in other people. I just like respect it, and I see it, and I think like now, especially, I think this month is like literally men's mental health.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like very great timing.
Yeah, totally didn't find that, but good.
Yeah. So we love it. And I think like that is such an important thing that we don't do enough, is like share our own parts, right? And so I think when people have these different perspectives around mental health, and everybody's so like, I respect their opinion, whatever they want or choose to believe is fantastic. However, I think that there are so many different platforms that nowadays it's really hard to figure out kind of like what is true and what is not true. I, of course, come from higher education, and I think that there's a lot of research that comes and backs this information, especially around like clinical depression. It's so prevalent, and there are so many different things that, right, become clinical when we have like a threshold that we cannot function at. That's really the difference. Is like humans, I love this idea of like our moods go up and down every single day, right? They're never stable. They're never just like plateauing. So we're up and down But when the trend is so far down and you're having all of these symptoms every single day, your system and literally like your brain chemistry, your hormones, your body, everything, it can no longer take it.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes clinical.
Yeah.
Because your body's not able to like create the right hormones that help you be okay and help you be happy and help you go back to the up and downs that we all face. And so I think, right, these clinical things are just basically like, have you met that threshold of not functioning well in your daily life and needing support?
Yeah.
So I ultimately, like, you asked the question of how do I face people and like interact with them around that topic. And I think my first thing is just like genuinely trying to understand and then helping them also see maybe some different angles of why like clinical would be something that's like different than like just normal ups and downs.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the thing with my guest is they genuinely had the right view on it. I think their perspective was that there was just like a situational depression,
Mhm.
and then
Yeah.
I think it was just kind of addressing how there's situational depression, which is what I
Yeah.
went through, and then there was clinical depression, which is like uncontrollable.
Mhm.
And one, I mean, not saying that one's better or worse than the other,
Mhm.
but in situational depression, I was kind of aware at a certain point that, okay, I'm depressed because I'm
Yeah.
losing a love for things. I'm not doing things that I usually do. So I
Mhm.
kind of try to get myself out of it, which is what he was talking about. You know, when
Right.
you're in that stage, you have it's on
Mhm.
you to kind of be self-aware and to like to take action towards it. And I
Yeah.
think that's the difference between clinical depression is where you
Mhm.
can be self-aware and you can realize you're going through it and whatnot, but no matter what you do, it's not going to change that.
Yeah.
And you have to do other things, like obviously get on medication or
Mhm.
start seeing a clinical psychologist or therapist, right? And that's the
Yeah.
difference between the two.
Yeah.
um,
You nailed that.
but are there any things that I missed on that, or is there anything that I have like kind of misconstrued?
No, I feel like that's very accurate. I think that there's this concept of like, and I even, as a therapist, like I'm a huge proponent of physical wellness and well-being, right? That's one of my huge passions in life.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of ideology around that being like, okay, if you have like your physical health in play and like you're doing well with that, you should be mentally fine. And yes, that's true for some people,
Yeah.
but there are also some cases where that's absolutely not true.
Right.
And with like even like people who are clinically depressed, they can go to the gym 5 days a week and do the hardest workouts of their life and it's not going to touch it.
Yeah.
And I like talk to all my clients about, hey, what about movement, right? Like all of these different holistic ways to help yourself, basically. However, sometimes people don't see that and they don't have the skills or the opportunity to be like, okay, this is situational right now. I'm going to do XYZ so it doesn't become pervasive.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's where you see that clinical piece come in where people just like had no idea, right? And they just like hit this different threshold.
Yeah, I mean, it's even crazy because there were points where I knew that I was depressed and I knew that I needed to get off this couch and do something, but then I
Yeah.
didn't want to still because there's lack of drive there too. So it's kind of like, even with that awareness, it doesn't mean that you're going to change your habits or lifestyle because you're not wanting to do anything. So yeah, it's kind of like a tricky situation. But yeah, in terms of like, I guess helping people who are listening right now and maybe they're in doubt, because there was a point where I was in doubt of whether I had depression or not. What advice would you give them to kind of seek that help or kind of take the steps towards either realizing whether they have situational or clinical depression? How can they identify the difference between the two for themselves?
Good question. I think that there are multiple pieces of that. I think the first question would be like them sitting down and taking some time to actually identify what their experience is, right? When we're in life, we're not always taking that moment to be aware fully, right? Like you can have this like overarching awareness, but you're not necessarily like, okay, what has led me here?
Yeah.
Right? Because there are factors that happen that make it so like, yeah, you totally just have a situational depression, or you have like what's called adjustment disorder, which would be situational depression. And so you're adjusting to something.
Yeah.
But if you look at your life and you're like, oh my goodness, I have been feeling this way for like years, that's when you want to be like, let's question this, right? Or even a year. I would say like a good threshold from my perspective is like 6 months. Where have you been in the last 6 months? And how does that look different than the 6 months before that? And so looking at that, and I would also say the difference would be important to identify if it's like adjustment or situational versus clinical.
Mm-hmm.
However, both can be really well served in a therapeutic setting, right? Like you can go with a situational depression and get so much support and so much help to help you have skills to support you through whatever comes in life.
Right.
And so I would say that's something I really want to like hone in on, is empowering people to like seek help no matter which one it is, if they're struggling to a point where they're like, oh, this might be something I should worry about. Or I'm talking to every friend I have about XYZ in my day and I can't stop.
Yeah.
Right? That's another sign, is like we go about our lives, and if it's like you keep going to every single friend and saying the same stuff, you're seeking answers.
Like about your situation. That's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
It was wild.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Good to know.
Yeah. And that's what most people do.
Yeah.
Right? And your family and your friends are like, what do I say?
Yeah.
Right? Or they're like, oh, I've told him 7 times.
Yeah.
This is what I think.
Yeah.
But you're
seeking. You try to find reasons and behaviors or patterns and things like that. Okay. It's good to know.
Yeah. Like you're seeking that out. I call that polling.
It's also, I feel like to a certain degree, it's kind of detrimental because you're hearing advice from so many different sources and they're not all the same pieces of advice. And then you get more conflict in your brain about like what the right way to go is. And then that adds on top of the already developing conflict you had about this, whatever you talked about.
Yeah.
Which is what I went through.
It's so overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, it's good to know that it's like a normal pattern of behavior.
Very normal.
Yeah. Okay. Well then, yeah, I don't have any other crazy. Well, I did want to bring up the questions that I came across on Instagram that I asked the poll. So
I sure love it.
one of my friends did mention that the reason he hasn't seen a therapist, or the reason he hasn't been going to a therapist, is because, and this reminded me of a scene from Ted Lasso where he basically complained to the therapist. He's like, why would I want to come here and talk to somebody who I'm just paying to listen to me? And like, it's like you're being paid to just listen and give advice. So I don't think it's genuine, or I don't feel like it's a genuine person I'm talking to. I feel like this person's on the clock and just doing it, which is exactly that scene in Ted Lasso. And the way she responded was really well said. But yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I think that is something I hear all the time from my adults who come to see me,
right?
Especially men. And I've seen that a lot recently, right? And I think I can validate that feeling is really fair, because even me, right, that therapist I went to see made me feel like that.
Yeah.
That she was basically there because she was getting paid.
Right.
To be on the phone with me for an hour. And so that really hurts, right? That's a painful experience. And I think the fear of rejection is what I see behind that, right? His fear of rejection of like, this person doesn't really care, right? And that's a human basic level is what we're all looking for, is connection and like feeling like we are cared about.
Right.
And one of the number one things as a predictor of success, quote unquote success in therapy or growth or healing, is rapport with your therapist. And so it is vital that you actually, like I would even say like vibe with them, right? Like that their energy is something that's like life-giving for you. Mm-hmm. Because if it's not, you're not going to benefit. You're going to go and you're going to be like, whatever, I can write this off.
Okay.
And so I always, right, like I even suss my clients out. When we do a consult, it's not just for them to see if I am the right fit for them. It's also like, are they the right fit for me to be able to serve them and have a relationship with them?
Right.
Because if we don't have that baseline, I can't get anywhere.
Yeah.
And I've seen that. I've had people I've worked with that we have such an amazing connection. We can have those conversations that are really vulnerable, and we get really, really far in therapy, and they have immense growth really quickly because they're open to me.
Right.
And open to what I share. I've also seen the flip side where that's not the case. And I've seen people struggle in the process of therapy.
So have you had situations where you had to turn away a patient from the first meeting, just realizing that you're not aligned, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've had that. So I think that's just part of making sure that I'm going to serve them in a way that's going to help them.
Right.
And if I'm not going to be that person, I want them to find that.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I do that as a dentist too, and I just started doing that at this office, which is great because the mentor is just like, not all these patients are for you, and like as dentists, sometimes we were taught like in I think it's more of a greedy approach. Like
Mm-hmm.
these are just,
Take them all.
yeah. But then he tells me he's like sometimes like it's not a right fit, and if
Mm-hmm.
they want to leave, they can leave. Like
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's great because not only are you respecting the patient,
Yeah.
but you're respecting yourself as a provider and realizing like you're giving them the most um, that they can get out of what they want.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's incredible.
Do you think can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah,
Do you think that comes down to like trust, right? I feel like dentistry is so much about trust
yeah.
in a similar way to mental health.
It's not only about trust with me, but trust in like the science or what I'm talking
Mm.
about. And like a lot of this office is focused on, we call it holistic, but we believe in science, we believe in
Mm.
data and research. And we have certain patients that don't want to get, fillings because there's some chemical that they don't like or they don't believe in fluoride and whatnot. And
Yeah.
we as dentists still believe in fluoride. We still try to find alternatives if we can.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're fully committed to believing that you don't need an x-ray because there's radiation there and it's going to whatever, then I can't serve you as a patient because you're not going to go to a heart surgeon without them getting a chest scan to make sure it's safe to do surgery, right? Same thing as a dentist. Like, so when there's a certain point where I realize that your inability to work with me is going to put me at risk, then I have to realize I have to let you go or whatnot.
Yeah.
And I'm respectful about it, and we try to be respectful. They have their views and we have ours, and there's probably a dentist out there that's going to do the treatment without worrying about that, and
Right.
maybe that's out there for them, but that's not us. And so I've had to learn or unlearn things here, which has been great because I'm unlearning things that are detrimental to my profession and relearning things that, sure, I might like lose 1,000 patients along the way, but I'm going to gain the right ones for me that, are fit for treatment. So I think hopefully listeners in healthcare realizes it applies to every profession, not only therapists, not only dentists. I think you have to really respect your patient and knowing that if they're the right fit for you, because it is a relationship. And if you want a long-term relationship with them, you have to make sure you align in a lot of your values, which is just like real relationships. Which is cool. But the other question was also from a guy. They were mostly from guys.
Love it. I'm glad.
There was one that was talking about how he's not going to therapy because he innately feels like he's a burden, and so that's holding him back from it. Is that a common thing you come across where they don't like to talk about it because they feel like they're burdening people with their problems?
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And
I would
how
say
do you approach that or respond to that?
I would say my first thought around that is that if that person has those true feelings of being a burden to someone they would be, right, like having a professional interaction with and paying, I would really worry that they may have, right, like the need for that support even more than somebody who may not say that.
Because they're probably doing it with friends and family too, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're probably universalizing that, right? Like if they're already thinking that about a therapist, my guess is that they might say that about their family, their friends, anybody. And so I would really urge that person to like really look at what's happening for them and seek that support even more.
Okay.
I would also say that is such a common response. And I even have clients right now that every week will say to me, "Oh, I'm wasting your time."
Yeah.
Right? I'm wasting your time.
Yeah.
I'm a burden on you.
Yeah.
And I have to support that person with that being how they feel.
Yeah.
And also, right, like help them be curious about why that's the case and then seeing the truth of what's actually going on and how much like I genuinely want to support them. And therapists out there want to support people. We don't go into this to be like, screw people, right? Like we go because we want to help them and we want to support them and see growth and healing.
Yeah.
And so any professional that you would see has that at the bottom line, right? And so you wouldn't be a burden. You would just be somebody who needs a little support. Yeah. And you're trying to like support them live a better life that's more authentic and aligned with what they need.
Yeah.
And so really like bottom line, I would really encourage whoever you are out there to definitely go forward, take those really brave steps. I know that's really scary and vulnerable, but it's also like the first step is the hardest and it gets a lot easier.
Okay.
I also want to speak to the fact, and I know I'm going off on this, but like men specifically feel this so much.
Yeah.
And it becomes, I think, partially like it's rooted in shame, right? Men have so much shame they deal with in life around mental health or around like well-being or seeking like support And that is so universal within like the US and outside of the US, but like men especially feel that way because they're like, I'm a burden because I am like seeking help when like they should get help just like everybody else. And there shouldn't be this weird stigma and shame around that.
Yeah. Is it also like I don't want to assume, but is it also like the cultural expectations on men as being the caretaker and being the provider? So like therefore they shouldn't be the ones that need caretaking or
Mm-hmm.
help like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say that's definitely the case.
Okay.
Or even these like gender roles and like boxes we put people in regards to like who's supposed to feel emotions,
Yeah.
who's supposed to be emotional.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's still crazy that like a lot of the phrases we come across, like "don't be a girl," don't be a pussy," don't like all these things where that kind of give the idea that in order to have these feelings or whatever, you're basically being a female, which is like crazy. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely taken me some time to break out of that. It's not something easy for anyone. And I still think I have a lot to work on. There's a lot of things I still do that are just ingrained in me as like I'm a brown guy who is male and raised in Texas. I'm like the perfect trio of like toxic masculinity. But like, I think it's like, it helps just like having not only like, people like you in our lives to like bring these up and talk about things and normalize it and not talk down to us either. I think like a lot of guys also feel scared because they're like, you know, they know they're going to get like lectured or whatnot about it. And, that's the last thing they want to deal with. But yeah, I think you've done a great job in like approaching it in a very understandable manner. And even when I told you about I'm not going to lie, the last episode, people were upset about the mental health thing, but I think you realize that, and I realize that too. Is like it's all based on your upbringing and it's based on just your background and what you've experienced, and so it's nothing on him at all because he's one of the nicest men I know, and like he'll help, you know, like anyone, and so I know that there's no negative intent on that, and it's just about education and talking about things, and you know his perspective might never change, but that's fine because I think he still has a generally good view about it. But there are some people that just need more education on it.
Yeah. But also say, right, like you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And that is something that like I live by is like this person just may not know.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Or they may not know like just generally like how hurtful that might be to folks who need that extra support. And then even, right, like moving through the shame of like men feeling like it's something that's just like fixable, right? Like it's not always just going to be like fixed by like doing these other things. And so I think like accepting him and accepting that there's like different understanding is huge.
Yeah.
And we all have to do that. We all don't know things. I don't know things.
Yeah.
Right. And I think like just understanding that at a basic human level and having so much love and compassion is the key to like everything in life.
That's true. Well, do you have any other tidbits or anything you want to?
Oh man, I don't know. I think something I thought was so exciting and I really wanted to talk about with you, and it's on this same train of things.
And I mean, if you have questions, for me too, go for it.
Yeah, I have all kinds of things. I know we're good. Like
no, we're good on time.
But this idea of passions, I was just like going to yoga, thinking about this really hard for the last week. It's this idea of like, okay, passions shift. So, right, like I can talk about mental health, but I also have all of these other things that I like love.
Yeah.
And I think there's this idea of like your passions are the stories you tell. And I think that is such a cool concept. And it makes me like, I'm geeking out just thinking about this concept.
Where did you learn about it?
So I had a client actually like literally say this to me the other day because he was talking about he had been from one state that was pretty conservative, pretty flat. Then he moved to Colorado and there was like mountains, and he was explaining how he was noticing people around him when he would go back to like the flat state where they drink a lot, but people would tell stories primarily about like partying and going out and like other people doing silly things when they're drunk or doing that, right? Like that, those were the stories he was hearing. And so then when he was in Colorado, there were all these stories about like amazing physical feats or skiing or like exercise or health, all these other like stories that you notice in different spaces. And so even like in Austin, we have our own stories that we all tell. And I think it's like this crazy concept that makes me excited to be like, okay, what kind of stories do we all want to tell, right? To each other in our lives? What kind of stories are we like excited to talk about? Because I can think about like you and I'm like, oh, he's excited to talk about movies and like music and all these like cool things. And those are like stories you love, right? You can talk about a show and it can be this fun, amazing conversation
Yeah.
that's so rich.
Yeah.
And like that, I think, is where like my head was spinning on like, where do we find that in our lives and how can we like notice those feelings of like excitement and joy and then start adding that to our life a lot more?
Yeah.
Because we all go through phases where like life's busy, but like we have to do that for our well-being and like for us to have like a great, rich life.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is just like an exciting thing. I'm like geeking out on talking to you about.
Totally great. This is going to be the sound bite that I use later on. But yeah, that's what I'm saying is like, even when I like hang out with friends, like I don't mind talking about the most, like they say boring, but it could be like literally my friend talking about ants. But if he's super passionate about ants, it makes it that much more entertaining because like they are just so like, enthusiastic about it. And I think that's so fun because I have been in situations where I'm talking to a patient about something they love and it's something I would have never thought somebody's like obsessed with or loves. Right. But it's just fun to listen to them state all these fun facts and stuff. And yeah, when you bring the story thing, it's kind of ironic because a lot of my passions are presented through an Instagram story, which is like, a digital way for me to present it. And it's fun because like, when I have my Top Tunes days, it's like, it's this like short period of time. I don't know who's watching it. I don't really care who's watching it. I just love doing it because it makes me happy and it makes me be a child for like 10 minutes to just talk about an artist or an album I love. And yeah, I love that. And I love the interactions I get after it because I'll have somebody be like, oh, I love this album or I connected to this or that. And that's what I love about the passion too, is because you'll find shared connections with other people through things, whether it's the same subject or something similar to it. And yeah, I mean, that's honestly why I did this podcast, because you don't get these opportunities to talk about things with these people. Like, it would be kind of weird if I was like, hey, Lacy, do you want to come over and just like talk about passions? But I mean, you would have been down for it. But like, not a lot of people would be down for stuff like that. They'd be like, what? That's weird, bro. Let's just like get dinner or something. But I think this forces us to sit down and like actually engage on that and gave you time to think about it, which is awesome. Yeah. Okay, I'm glad you like took the time to like actually.
Yeah. I was excited.
Yeah.
I like learned a lot
super excited
about myself even.
Yeah. And like, I know people are excited to listen to you because like therapists in general, I think are such an interesting thing in our society because everyone needs a therapist. And yet it's something that not everyone has. And it's not even people don't stress the importance of it as much like we do as like millennials and younger people now, thankfully. But for a long time, therapists were kind of like an optional thing, and they still are considered an optional thing, but more so being focused on. So I think, for you to go into a profession that not many people even consider going to see is admirable, and you do it with the intention of wanting to help people. So like, thank you for that. And hopefully it'll become a more common thing, but I think you're doing great stuff, and you're one of the reasons I went to a therapist. So I appreciate that.
My heart.
Yeah. And so, what else? I feel like there's so much more we can cover though. Are there any like stigmas or anything you want to break about therapy or anything that like people assume about you that's not true?
Oh, that's a good question.
That was one of the questions, I think.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, I think there's so many stigmas when we think about mental health.
Yeah.
There's so many.
Especially just like cinema and Hollywood. Like, when I think about therapy, I automatically think about Sopranos and like that whole thing. Because like, I think people automatically assume you go to a therapist if you're a killer or like, like you have all these mental health issues. They don't realize like you go to therapy, like you go to a dentist for a regular cleaning. It's like you go for checkups, right? You want to make sure everything's fine. Your thought processes are working well and whatnot. So, I mean, that's one stigma I'm assuming is
it's a huge stigma.
Yeah.
Right. And that you're like broken.
Yeah.
This idea of like you have to be like broken and at like bottom of the pit to go to therapy is so not true.
Yeah.
I have people who are functionally like very, very great in life. Like they are functioning so well, have amazing careers, amazing families, all these things. And yet they still are struggling with something. And I think there's this idea that like we look around as humans and we're like, everyone else is doing great,
Yeah.
right? We have these rose glasses.
Yeah.
And
It's
we're
like
like,
it's like as kids we thought like our parents and everyone was totally functional, but then you like grow up and you're like, wait,
yeah,
they're like just as
no.
messed up as I am right now. But yeah,
Yeah, and we don't talk about it,
no,
right? I think there's like this concept of like, I'm the only one struggling. And so then we like isolate instead of actually seeking community and support.
yeah,
And I think if we broke that stigma of like everyone else is good and I'm not, we would heal the world.
yeah,
Like I know that's a crazy statement, but like ultimately I really truly feel that way.
yeah,
And I feel like that starts with one individual being vulnerable to another. Right? Like even with you and I'm very vulnerable with you.
yeah,
And that is not necessarily, even as a therapist, not my favorite activity to be emotionally vulnerable. That's hard.
yeah,
That's a hard thing to do. And so I think knowing that, it's like we all need to start that and we all need to spark that within each other so that we can have those authentic moments of like, wow, all of us are having this experience because humanness is universal.
yeah.
We all have pain, heartache, whatever it is. And so I think like starting there and breaking that stigma is key.
Okay.
I also feel like, I don't know, there's so many stigmas around like social media.
Yeah.
Like I love social media. You're amazing social media, right? Like you're passionate about it.
Yeah, but
It's also really awful.
yeah,
And there's a ton that goes into like people's mental health and like how social media is impacting that significantly.
yeah. I think it's
Especially
a
our
lot.
kids.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to use social media to like in a good way than a
Mm.
bad way. I feel like the danger pits in it are a lot deeper than like the positives.
Yeah.
And it's easy to spiral into those. I mean, it's a daily thing. It's like I'm constantly trying to make sure I'm like using it for a good reason and not like I don't know. You go through those doom scrolls sometimes, and you have to really
Yeah.
self check yourself. And yeah, I think therapy's been great for that because it's given me the self awareness to like step back and be like, okay, I can't compare myself to like this person, that person, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's you're right in that regard. But
Another stigma, sorry to interrupt you.
yeah,
I have
no,
another one that popped into my head.
yeah,
Is this idea that like therapy alone will fix you.
yeah,
This is probably not my because I'm like, oh, what do clients come to me and they say during consults that
yeah.
I'm always like, oh no.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that too. I thought like within my first few therapy sessions, I was like, I'm supposed to like be fixed by now, right? And
Yeah.
you're not.
No.
But
So I think it's important to speak to that is like you don't go to therapy and like have a session and you just like walk out and you're like, I'm good.
yeah,
That's not real. And I think accepting that is part of the therapeutic process. And therapists, right? Like we walk people through that because we know that's the case. And sometimes they come in with that expectation.
mhm,
And so I would even like, if you're going to go to therapy, have that question of like, what am I trying to get out of this? And my hope would be your therapist would ask you that in the consult of like, what are your expectations or hopes? Because you have to put in the work in order for things to heal. And it's like this equation of wellness is little micro shifts that you have to choose every single day in order to heal over time.
mhm,
And so like the stigma and like the ultimate like falsehood we all fall into is like, oh, it's gonna fix me. I don't have the magical wand that's gonna fix anybody.
yeah,
They have those answers
yeah,
themselves.
right,
I just get to walk alongside them.
yeah,
And I think that's a helpful lens too, is right, like finding a therapist you want to walk alongside.
it's like a mental shaman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good way to
You
put
can
it.
steal that. That's fine.
I am gonna steal that. That's
Oh, okay.
magical.
But yeah, that's awesome. Well, it's definitely, I think that's definitely helpful advice for people that are probably looking into it or wanting to go into it because yeah, I can
Mhm.
vouch that I was definitely guilty for thinking that
Yeah.
I was
We
going to
all
be fixed, and now I see it as like a working out, like it's like a mental muscle that you just have to keep working at. And there are days you're not going to be great. There are days you're going to need it more than others. Like there's some weeks where I have nothing to talk about, and then there's
Yeah.
some weeks where like you just can't stop talking about something, and
Mhm.
it's never a consistent thing. But yeah, I'm grateful for y'all, and I'm grateful for you. So
It's such an honor. I'm thankful for you.
yeah, thanks. Well,
It's so awesome.
is there anything else you wanted to address before?
Oh
I feel like you covered
man,
a
we
bit.
covered so much.
Yeah.
I really think we talked about a lot.
I mean,
I have so much I
I'd
could
be
keep
so
talking
happy to
about.
have you on again. We'll definitely have you on again soon, and I
Deal.
think next time maybe I'll have you on with like maybe another friend who can also
Ooh,
address stuff, or maybe another therapist. We'll see.
that'd be cool.
But yeah, thank you, Lacy, for coming on. I
Uh,
love you, and I'm super thankful you're in my life. And as for the viewers, thanks for listening. Do you have any last final thoughts for listeners?
Oh my gosh. I'm just so excited to be here.
Yeah.
I adore you.
Love you too.
And I can't wait to come back on the podcast.
Yeah.
So I hope you guys like it.
Yeah. And this is Hanging Out with Hamza. Go pursue your passions. I forgot what the end line is, but just take care of yourselves and be nice to each other, like Lacy says, and go to therapy.
That's right.
Okay. Bye.